Hello, my name is Fred Robinson, and I welcome you to the last talk of our 6-week series, Baked In, Systemic Racism Around and Within Us. Our speaker will be Professor Carlton Floyd of USD's Department of English. His talk will be on the facts and fictions of systemic racism. Professor Floyd came to USD from UCSD, where he completed his PhD with a dissertation titled, Wish You Were Not Here, Modern Responses to Mixed Bodies. I mention that title because it signals his abiding interest in interracial literature, multi-ethnic identities, and metaphor, which entails the bringing together, indeed, the identification of two separate things. His scholarship, not surprising given the above, is collaborative. He has collaborated with Thomas Reefer of USD's Sociology Department in a book presently under contract titled The American Dream and Dreams Deferred, a Dialectical Fairy Tale. He has also published 2 essays on playwright August Wilson, one of them co-written with his English department colleague, Cynthia Kaywood. Professor Floyd has taught courses, many courses, but some of them are fairy tales, metaphor, interracial literature, exiles and immigrants, and dark matters, Black fantasy and mystery. Since he once gave a convention lecture titled Why the Humanities and Anachronistic Justifications, Current Public Need, and Dying American Dream, it is especially appropriate for him to present a humanities center lecture. Please welcome Carlton Floyd.
Dr. Robinson, that's a lovely introduction. I hope to live up to it a bit, and so nice to see so many delightful faces. This is like coming home, so this feels good. And I hope not to bore you. I hope to keep your attention for about 20, 30 minutes. And then I hope that we have a rousing, thoughtful discussion. I've entitled this to, oh, by the way, let me thank the Humanities Center. Absolutely, Linda is just amazing. And again, Fred, and all of the officials that participate in that venture on campus. So we're going to talk about the facts and fictions of systemic racism. And I'll get to defining some of those terms shortly. But let me begin with simply saying, I think we often leave language and language usage at the side door when it comes to thinking about things like racism, systemic racism, and other things that truly ought to matter to us. So I want to attempt to put it in the front. I also want us to consider not only how we read, but what we read and what we do with it in this process. So this is in large part about language and language usage. It's about literature and history. And I hope that I generate some questions as we go. So if you Google the phrase civil rights movement, you might see the following definition highlighted from history.com. Quote, the civil rights movement was an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain rights, equal rights under the law. It began in the late 1940s and ended in the late 1960s. While these dates are modified on the site itself, to say that this movement, quote, took place mainly during the 50s and 60s is still to damage history and memory. And so let's see what we might do about that. The first official Civil Rights Act in the United States was passed in 1866. This act declared all male persons born in the United States to be citizens without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. And although President Andrew Johnson vetoed the legislation, that veto was overturned by the 39th United States Congress and the bill became law. The gist of these comments about history, or more accurately about how our history is presented, are meant to suggest that inaccurate or incomplete depictions of history give us inaccurate or incomplete understandings of who we are, where and what we've come from, and thus we find ourselves to live by incomplete facts and thus by misrepresentations or fictions. Movements for civil rights, and thus pleas for civil rights, were happening obviously long before the 1940s. The first clause of the definition, that part that states the civil rights movement was an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law, suggests that there was only one civil rights movement, that no organized efforts to seek freedom from racial discrimination existed before or after the specified time period, and perhaps most importantly, that only Black people sought to end prejudice and find equal rights under the law, and that such efforts occurred nowhere else in U.S. culture or society. In fact, people of virtually every racial persuasion or identification organized to end racist forms of discrimination and to begin the acquisition of equal rights under and beyond the law. The aforementioned definition, its matter-of-fact representation, can lead us easily to an understanding of our history that is more a matter of fiction than it is of fact. I want to offer this representation of history as evidence of systemic racism. Please note, I am not calling out the authors of this documentation of civil rights as racist. Rather, I am stating that misrepresentations of our history, which is easy enough to do by anyone, suggest a way in which racism is baked into our system, to reference the title of this series. And I do so to suggest our need to dig a little deeper into our history and into our language and our language usage to see systematic racism at work. Now, some definition of systematic racism might be useful here. A system, according to Oxford Languages, is a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnecting network, and a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized framework or method. Systemic then means something embedded in the system. Systems like our societal, political, educational, and judicial or juridical organizations, which is fundamental to how that system functions. We can define racism as an unequal and unfair treatment of persons because of their presumed race, based on the belief that some races are better than others and may thus be treated as better or worse accordingly. Now, race is effectively an arbitrary way of labeling particular groups of people. Race is not itself racist. I have this discussion virtually every semester. It is, however, wildly inaccurate. We ascribe race to biology and assume that race has something relevant to say about who we are based on presumably corresponding biological or genetic characteristic. But there is no corresponding genetic link to that ascription that supports any of the intended notions that follow. There is no evident genetic link, for example, between, say, one's morals, intelligence, longevity, or behavior, and one's race. There are links to the social, economic, political, and cultural environments in which these groups are shaped, however. To be specific, more genetic differences exist within any race than exists between races. And thus, the links we make between biology and race are, quite frankly, largely fictional. And race is largely without much relevance when detached from the racist claims we make about racialized groups. One such claim we ascribe to race is the concept of racial purity. And it is also fictional and, quite frankly, ridiculous. Most of us are racially mixed, although we may not appear to be so. And our racial classifications, which are often based simply on what we see, break down rather quickly and easily when we begin to see them in action. As, for example, when we classify someone like our former president, Barack Obama, as Black, knowing full well that his mother is identifiably white, or when we classify our former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who is as Black as he is Irish, as memory serves. And yet we tend to identify Obama as the first Black president, as opposed to, say, the first visibly Black president, and Powell as our first Black Secretary of State. Now, I am not here to decide whether these cultural figures are or are not really Black. I am here to say that we have taken a fiction and elevated it to a fact. I am calling out our propensity to assign an identification and to decide that such an identification functions as an identity, where the term identification refers to, quote, the action or process of identifying someone or something, or the fact of being identified. And the term identity refers to the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. In terms of race, a racial identity is ironically a fiction, whereas a racial identification may well be understood as a fact. I'm defining the term fact as, simply put, verifiable information, and the term fiction as a fabrication, and also as, and this is a very important definition, a belief or statement that is false, but that is often held to be true because it is expedient to do so. Now, I didn't make that definition up. I stole it from a dictionary online. But also, we might do well to ask, expedient for whom and for what reasons? You can personally identify as non-racist or even anti-racist and still be implicated in systemic racism by being a part of a systemically racist organization. Also note that not all races are white, for a system must employ a systematic approach to racism, implicating all races embedded in it. Consider, to cite but one example, the Black and white supremacist Leo Felton, who was convicted in 2005 for plotting to bomb several Jewish synagogues and Black churches. More importantly, for our purposes, consider the title to the article the New York Times published about him, entitled, oddly, The Black Supremacist. This title leads one to conclude that Felton supported Black rather than white supremacy. Also can be read as a denial of the very racial mixing of which Felton is a product, a denial of the identifiably multiracial body, and an absence of white supremacy, not only as the subject of the article, but also as the central tenet of Felton's beliefs. Felton, I believe, is quoted, and I'm going to paraphrase badly here, but being upset at his father, who was Black, I believe also Canadian, or certainly lives in Canada, of quote unquote muddying his white blood. This is the basis upon which his other kind of thoughts, ideologies, philosophies took shape. Everybody still with me? Doing okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay. When racist fictional beliefs are elevated to facts, we run into some disturbing problems that have plagued and continue to plague life in the United States. Let's examine my assertion in the frame of the presumed virtues of our juridical system. John Rawls begins his philosophical study, The Theory of Justice, 1971, by describing justice as, quote, the first virtue of social institutions. According to Rawls, the first principle of justice is that everyone should, in short, have an equal right to the liberties covered in the Bill of Rights. While this principle deserves more attention, it would take away from my purpose today, which is captured in Rawls' second principle of justice. According to the second principle, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. Therefore, as Rawls sees it, injustice is simply those inequalities that are not to the benefit of all. Well, in theory, this sounds wonderful, while in reality, it is something else altogether. Watch what happens to this notion in actuality. Besides the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the text that captures the nation's attitude about racialized fairness during the antebellum period is the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1856. In his delivery of the opinion concerning, quote, whether African Americans are citizens of the United States and thus able to file suit in court, Chief Justice Taney concluded the following. African Americans had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully, this is my favorite part, be reduced to slavery, here's my really favorite part, for his benefit. Wow, what this ruling suggests, among other things, is that even if Black people had rights, white men had no reason to consider them. In such a frame, justice, particularly as represented in Rawls' second principle, becomes largely fictional in Taney's hands. To put this another way, if social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, then the way in which inequalities can benefit everyone are reframed in the following way. White men benefit from not having to care about the rights of Black people, and Black people benefit from white men not having to care about the rights of Black people. That's wonderful logically. I'm being deeply facetious here. Now, this to my mind is some seriously twisted logic, but logic nonetheless, that provided a means of making unjust treatment just, at least until the aforementioned Civil Rights Act of 1866 passed, which sought to provide some respite from it, but did not, to my mind, prevail in some large part because these ways of being in the world extended far beyond the law. Although African Americans would finally get citizenship and status and rights with the help of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Taney's approach to racial injustice continued to dominate the thinking of the Supreme Court, as evident in the court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, when the infamous separate but equal doctrine became the law of the land. According to Justice Henry Brown's majority opinion, the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce absolute equality of the races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Brown used Taney's claim about Black people being unfit to associate with the white race to argue that racial segregation was legal, so long as Black and white people were provided equal facilities. And I don't get the sense that he asked any Black people what they thought. Instead, speaking paternalistically for them, or more aptly, speaking for white folks like him, being unbound from any need to show Black folks any respect. History tells us that facilities were never equal and that this inequality benefited white folks and not Black folks, except of course in the twisted logic presented by Taney. This way of understanding justice frames perfectly unjust systems as just, making it easier for us to see justice as just blind and a tad crazy. And this unjust sense of justice still seems to guide us. From roughly 1865 to 1877, during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, we enter a period typically called Reconstruction, which can be characterized as an attempt to create a multiracial democracy in America. For instance, during this period, I've already mentioned the amendments that were passed, which finally gave African American citizenship status and the rights that accompany such status. However, these attempts to create a multiracial democracy that was bound to respect the rights of all of its citizens was quickly quashed. As the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois describes it, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. This movement back towards slavery is now commonly known as by the term Jim Crow, And during Jim Crow, Black segregation and disenfranchisement became the rule in virtually every aspect of society, upheld and enforced by police, mob rule, attitudes, belief structures, and the like. Consider some of the rules that existed in Jim Crow America. I could not, for example, shake hands with a white male because this act suggested social equality. I certainly could not shake hands with a white female if I liked my life, as these acts were thought to suggest not only social equality, but intimacy, one of the key reasons offered for lynching Black men. Black and white people could not eat together unless whites were served first, and some sort of partition existed between them. No Black on Black PDA, that's public displays of affection for the old folks like me, was allowed because it offended whites. While following these rules increased the Black person's chances of living and avoiding bodily harm, it was not in any way just unless one accepts the dogma of justice presented above. Between 1889 and 1932, some 3,745 people were lynched in the United States. At least these are those of which we are aware. While other races and sexes were also lynched during this period, Black men were the primary targets and victims of lynching. They were lynched as a response to often fabricated claims of inappropriate intimacies with white women for achieving economic success. In fact, entire towns were burned down because of economic success. Or as in the case of Albert Roger and his son in 1984, I think Albert was about 70, his son was about 17. They were shot for just being Negroes. Until 1974, when the court overturned the Plessy decision in Brown v. Board of Education, this unjust sense of justice prevailed in the legal landscape. And I contend well after Brown v. Board of Education, Jim Crow lived on in the legal and extra legal worlds, undercover, or really, and more aptly as an open secret, known to most but rarely openly discussed. These systems, legal and extra legal, social and cultural, resident in the United States, didn't just shuffle off to retirement. They didn't just die off either. This is so not only because of the deaths of yet more Black people in the hands of non-Black people and the police National Guard state, but also because I suspect those who have come and gone before us would look at life now and see something eerily similar to what they saw then. Black people dying at what might seem to be unprecedented rates, but for which there is, sadly, substantive precedent. It is no wonder then why Brian Stevenson remarks in his book, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, published in 2015, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Stevenson's point, I believe, is that any system that creates and sustains injustice, particularly one that sees injustice as somehow inherently just, is actually actively unjust, and that fixing it requires something other than money. It requires justice that sees injustice as well, actually unjust. It requires us to carefully consider and to do so within a historically contextualized frame the following facts. As of 2018, African-American adults were 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites. As of 2001, 1 in every 3 Black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime. It requires us to consider, as former Georgetown law professor David Cole asserts, that there are 2 legal systems in one here, one for the rich and often white, and another for everyone else. A look at the recent sentencing of Lori Loughlin and her husband should affirm this thought. Given the short sentence she received for her crimes and her ability, which just floors me, to choose where she wished to serve her time. That is just unheard of in my world. Hopefully it's not unheard of in yours, but give that some thought for a minute. Consider finally Michelle Alexander's assertion in the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, that more African-American men are in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850 before the Civil War began. So while Black enslavement may have ended legally, does the preceding information suggest that it also ended actually? Or was it, just to borrow a current phrase, rebranded? Even for me, at the tender young age of 62, I remember the protests against racism and the subsequent backlash that stretched across the 1960s. I was very young then, but those days of seeing the National Guard and the police on the streets of my neighborhood stuck with me. I grew up in the Glenville neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. In 1968, Glenville erupted along with much of the rest of the country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, sparking days of protest and anguish. In June of 1968, the police and the National Guard, seeking to root out an arm of the Black Panthers and one of its members, Fred Ahmed Evans, posted up on just about every street corner I passed on my way home from school. I mention these moments of these memories of early moments in my life because for me, our current moment is a kind of deja vu moment. Yet again, to borrow a word from the writer and activist James Baldwin, I am a witness to the atrocities that occur within and beyond our nation state. And yet again, I see an outpouring of interest in understanding racism in its various forms, as well as the costs, the consequences of such. And while I applaud and stand with these efforts to bring radical change to the United States and the inspiration this has provided for similar movements across the globe, I am very clear that I, indeed we, have been here time and time again. Still, I applaud any effort to bring a nation that perpetually claims to be what it is not for far too many to move toward a place where its rhetoric about itself becomes reasonably close to matching its reality. That is to say, where the United States of America functions as a refuge for those seeking to be free from unfair and unequal treatment, rather than as a place where there seems an abyss, to borrow from James Baldwin again, between its rhetoric and its realities. And a place in which its fictions about itself might actually become facts. And the fictions that's elevated to facts might well be demoted. Allow me to turn to James Baldwin one last time as a kind of benediction. Give me a second. Nobody Knows My Name, a letter from the South, originally published in Partisan Review in 1959, Baldwin asserts as follows: if we can liken life for a moment to a furnace, then freedom is the fire which burns away illusion. Any honest examination of the national life proves how far we are from the standard of human freedom with which we began. The recovery of this standard demands of everyone who loves this country a hard look at himself, for the greatest achievements must begin somewhere, and they always begin with the person. If we are not capable of this examination, we may yet become one of the most distinguished and monumental failures in the history of nations. I'm going to cut it at that point. I do appreciate you guys listening to me. I hope it was at least reasonably clear and hopefully productive. I'm looking for some discussion and questions.
You feel that the response of students in your classes to your work with the literature and culture and them is different these days from what it was when you came to USD earlier, or are you confronting something similar in terms of attitude, resistant appetite for what you have to say, recognition, and so on?
Wow, that's a wonderful and interesting question. I would say that certainly the times have changed. And because we are in a very kind of formative moment, both with COVID and all the other crazy things that are happening, particularly with George Floyd and the myriad of other people who have been hurt. Currently, the trial of Chauvin. I would say that I get a number of thoughts and comments that are particular to the moment, but like in previous moments, many of those thoughts and comments tend to come from an ahistorical place, which is why I went historical in this piece. That is to say, a lot of people seem unaware that similar moments have happened again and again and again. A lot of people seem unaware that something like civil rights is not just for and about Black people. So I guess my answer to that, Irene, would be I'm getting a lot of the same kind of questions of resistance, but I'm also getting, and I'm always grateful for it, a number of students who are just simply curious and interested. And that is a beautiful thing. It's actually one of the reasons I keep teaching.
One of the things that you said really stuck out to me, which was when you were talking about how justice is only possible when it's considered in a historically contextualized frame. And I was thinking about that in conjunction with the conversations that are going on in our communities about systemic change, whether it be in the court system, the police system, the education system, you name it. And realizing that those conversations are often happening, but the historical context is being left out. What are your thoughts or recommendations? I'm not sure what the right word is there to bring that historical context into those conversations. Obviously it needs to be there, but the ways in which we can do that.
Wow, wonderful question and a difficult one. My answer to that would be this. We need to impress upon people that without that context, they are reinventing the wheel. What I mean by that is, if you're unaware that folks have tried this before, then you're unaware of what they tried, which means that you'll try the same exact thing and expect a different result. And pretty much that is, I'm told, the definition of insanity. So my point, bluntly speaking, is, look, you have to understand what this is coming out of and what has shaped it, what the language is that we've used about it. Otherwise, you're going to do, quite frankly, what systemic racism relies on, which is go through the same hurdles, end up in the same place, find yourself back 3 steps, even though you tried to take 4, and we'll do it all again, by the way, in another 10 years or so. I hope that answers your question, but I think it really has to be made clear that repeating the same things and expecting a different result just doesn't make much sense. The other thing I really want to add to that is when we're talking about a system, I really want to give a kind of a different metaphor. Let me put 2 on the table. I've had a couple of what I call beater cars in my lifetime. The fix and drive. I'm sure a few of you know what I mean, right? Every time you step in it, there's something else that needs repairing. You're hoping those bald tires will make it another week till you can afford to buy 2 of them when you need 4. That kind of thing. When that happens, and if you are capable of it, ultimately, what do? You buy another car. Because that one is done. Let me give another answer. If you have done any kind of work on a house or own a house or live in something that looks like a house, one of the things you discover is that if you have something like a cracked foundation, number one, the value of your house just plummeted. Number 2, building anything on that cracked foundation is a problem for obvious reasons. It doesn't have anything solid to stand on. And what I'm suggesting to you is that what we're looking at is fundamental to the structure of this nation. And if we're going to make any actual systemic change, we need to go back and look at how we fundamentally constructed this nation. Reconceptualize, reconceive it. The rest is what I call window dressing, if that makes any sense. That was a long-winded answer to your question, Tracy. I apologize, but I hope that's helpful.
I really appreciated when you included a few just stories about your own memories and your own connections to these events. And I'm wondering if you do that with your students, and if you do, what kinds of things do you share with them, and how do they respond? How do you sort of help them understand? Because I find my students are really persuaded by anecdotal evidence in ways that sometimes I think they shouldn't be. So how do you handle that with your students?
That's a great question. I tend to be fairly vulnerable and open for the purpose of helping, hopefully, others to find an okay space to be vulnerable and open as well. Because many of the things we're discussing when we're talking about racism in any form, we've been kind of taught not to talk about. And so I want to make people understand that, yes, I'm going to put myself out here. Yes, I know a few people are going to laugh. Yes, I know I might, end up being more vulnerable than I want. But I actually think that that's part of my job, right? I try to be careful about how much and to whom, but I regularly share parts of my life with my students. To wit, I'll just give you a very brief example of something I shared with some of my students recently. I pointed out that my family, as much loved as I have for them, that my family has been devastated. It wasn't a claim for any kind of pity. It was simply to say that the fact that I have one sister that's still in a vegetative state, a sister that is manic depressive and schizophrenic, a sister whose health is always questionable, another who just had a stroke, a brother who fell down a couple of weeks ago and couldn't get up. Somebody had to help him. I wanted to point out that despite the fact that I have a PhD, I have two sisters with master's degrees, I have a sister that used to run a charter school. Despite all these ways in which we have so supposedly achieved the American dream, there has been a cost to living in America, if you will, that my family has suffered. And I'd like to see those kinds of costs not continue to build for so many of the people I know. So I shared that. Turns out that a few students probably snickered, but then I started getting emails and text messages from students also offering and thinking about ways in which their lives have been not quite up to the standards of the American dream. It doesn't mean they're not grateful, but they can see ways to improve. That's what I want. So I'm willing to do it. I hope that helps, Karen.
I hope it isn't in line that I make a comment more or less rather than asking a question.
Sure.
But what really disturbs me is the fact that the way a lot of the discussion, the ongoing discussion for the past few months has gone, is to focus on symbolic gestures and relatively trivial improvements rather than expensive, disruptive changes in business as usual. For example, I've signed the White Allies paper and all that good stuff, but I got nowhere trying to promote a program to get minority-owned contractors to be employed by the University of San Diego. But that's the local issue. The broader issue is I support reparations, not reparations for past ancestors' slavery, but reparations for the ongoing economic disadvantage as a consequence of the inability to pass along intergenerational wealth, as a consequence not only of employment discrimination, but redlining. Now, currently, the median Black family has 1/10 the wealth of the median white family, and that amounts to around $90,000, which seems to me a good figure, but nobody's going to go for that. So what bugs me is that instead of promoting material improvement, not only through reparations, but through affirmative action to counteract ongoing discrimination, which is an empirical fact, the material stuff, the expensive, disruptive stuff is not being taken care of. And instead, we're being distracted by symbolic gestures and a variety of feel-good programs. So this is really what bugs me. And I kind of wonder about how one can do something about this?
I can certainly say it really disrupts me too. It is deeply disturbing how much time we spend on things that often might make us feel good for a minute, but don't really change the system we're in. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen. There are other forms of racism in place. But one of the things that I have been pushing people to do, including myself, by the way, is get involved in local politics, get involved in groundswell efforts to make changes where we live. Because in fact, many of the decisions we're talking about, things like homelessness in San Diego and what we do with it, have to do with being in those positions to be able to affect some kind of relevant change. My response to that is twofold. One, I'm not saying stop what you're doing. I'm saying look carefully at what you're doing and ask a very simple question. Is it impacting anything that is systemic, or is it impacting something that is surface? Once we get past that, then we can begin to talk about, well, what might change things systemically.
I wrote it in the chat, but I wasn't sure Harriet was going to see it. And I'm not sure, people may not know this, but the anti-racism task force that has been working at USD presented their recommendations to the president probably in January. And I know that the president then wrote up a plan given the recommendations, and he presented that plan at the Board of Trustees on Friday. And so I got to see an early draft. I don't know if the plan was actually, I think it was approved. I was there. So some things are done in executive session, but it was approved. And in that plan, Harriet, is exactly what you're talking about, that procurement and the contracts will be monitored at a level that USD has never done in the past. So your voice probably was one of the voices that was heard there, and it is built in. It is built in. There's a lot of other things that are built into the plan too. I'm not quite sure when he's going to release it, but be aware it's coming out. It's called the Horizon Project.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Floyd. So I'm a professor in the School of Nursing, and I'm also a mother of a half-Black daughter. So this summer was actually the hardest summer of being a mother. So being a white mom to a Black daughter has been quite a challenge this summer. We had some really frank conversations, and for the first time in 57 years of my life, did some protesting with her this summer. But she brought up some conversations about why I did not have conversations with her growing up about her identity. And you brought up some interesting points about racial identity, right? I raised her to be a strong person and to have strong values. And when I told her, I didn't think about how society would see her. I didn't think about that society would see her as a Black girl. And I apologized to her for that. Her dad wasn't in the picture much after her about 5 or 6 years old. Has come in the picture a little later in life, but so I apologize. There was nothing, as a white woman, it's hard for me to teach her that identity that she should have learned from her father. But we've gotten in a really great place now. But I don't really have a question here, but it's hard to help her with how society will see her. They see her as her color first, whereas I tell her they don't see me that way first. I have an opportunity that she does not, right? They see I'm allowed to have an opinion first, or I'm allowed to talk first. She's seen as a color first, and a value is put on that before she even gets to talk, which hurts my heart to no end. And this has been, like I said, this has been the hardest year of my life, being her mother, and to see what she's gone through in the last year, it's been heartbreaking. That, and what's been heartbreaking also is the disparity in what's gone on with the pandemic for people of color, that it's hit those communities so much harder than other communities. It's just been heartbreaking. The inequities in our healthcare system for people of color has been just, I said this year has just been heartbreaking for me as a nurse, as a mom, you know, so I've been to almost every one of these sessions every Tuesday. So I thank you for your time today and for this session. It's done my heart good to hear all this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I appreciate your comments very, very much. And delighted to have someone from the nursing school hanging out with us. That's cool. That makes me very happy. I would actually deeply applaud your vulnerability, if you will, to your daughter and your honesty and being able to step up and say, hey, you know, I didn't know. Bluntly speaking, I think that's one of the first steps most of us need to take is the ability to say, I simply didn't know.
Yeah.
But you know, you can always follow that with, but I'm going to find out. And I think that opens up possibilities that we rarely have. It seems to me that we certainly have a very strange system, and we have constructed a world in which it is possible to not see what's right for you, if you will. And, you know, I think we really got to push this. Somebody's leaving. Thank you for coming. I saw that really quickly. I think we really have to push something we do so terribly in this culture, which is actually talk across these so-called racial divides, which are substantial, even if they have been completely fabricated and made up. They are very strong. We've got to get across them. We've got to have these conversations across these divides. And speaking of COVID, very good friend of mine I actually went to college with. Turns out he's very educated, by the way. We're talking middle class, Black America. His wife's mother passed about 2 weeks ago. His wife's father passed about 2 weeks later from COVID. She got COVID, and then her husband got COVID. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying to myself, this makes perfect sense. And, you know, when Texas is opened back up and other places have decided, you know, 10% of the people vaccinated, but we're all good.
Yeah.
We do stupid things and call it wisdom. You know, for no other reason, if I can be blunt, especially given that, by the way, we all kind of live together in this country, that we might actually figure out some ways to not kill each other. And COVID is one of the clear examples of it. If you can't follow that, I'm not sure how I can help you. By the way, I see one of my oldest friends in the world sitting in here. Dr. Hassan Doody is in the corner. I went to college with Hassan way, way back in the day. I won't say how far back in the day. I'm delighted he showed up, and he'll probably lambast me later with all the things I didn't mention. So I'm just going to give him an opportunity now. I bounce all of my ideas off of him on at some point or another. Dr. Doody, you got any thoughts, comments, questions?
I just have a statement to make at the end and wonder what you thought of it. One of the most baked in aspects has to do with vaccination distribution. And very enlightened people have arranged this thing so that it will be equal and will get to the people who need it, wherever they live, whatever race they are and everything. And it doesn't work. It works a little bit, but it was with all the best intentions, the differences are so baked in that they can't do anything about it.
I have a swift answer to that, Fred, if I may. The answer is quite simple. We have a system that privileges those who can pay. And until we build a system that privileges those who cannot, we're simply going to continue to make the same kinds of mistakes. bluntly speaking.
If I can add to that, seeing I'm the nurse in the room, right? There's also distrust of the African American community of the healthcare. They don't trust that it's going to do what it says it's going to do. I don't know that they enrolled enough people of color in the vaccine trials to garner that trust.
Certainly don't trust them, but I have enough friends in healthcare and who have already gotten a shot. They're still alive. So I figure I might as well try it. But I still don't trust them. I give Dr. Dahoudi the last word here.
Oh, well, thank you. I've enjoyed your presentation very much. I enjoyed what I've seen. I came in a little late due to another work meeting, but I thought it was really great. I had sent you a little text on the side, but I think you got there regarding the insanity of doing the same thing again when we come to these trials. I wanted to underscore what I think is the real strength of your conversation is what that also allows us to do is to avoid the systemic and structural. And I think you kind of got there, right? And it becomes essentially when, you know, if we talk about Chauvin or some of these other cases, you know, criminal cases that are progressing and we don't understand the history, as you mentioned, we avoid the structural. It becomes a case of just a bad apple in the barrel that we heard a lot, right? We've heard that over the last 4 years, whenever something happened, there's a bad apple in the barrel versus being informed by history and understanding the systemic and structural basis of some of the divisions that we see in the inequities. Very interesting. I've enjoyed your conversation and particularly the orientation over the historical, because I think that needs to be brought to light into the present to inform these conversations, because we'll never get past the structural, the systemic, if we view it as a bad apple, right?
Right.
And whether that be in housing discrimination, whether it be in the inequities that we see, the American Medical Association, I'm sure the nurse in the room will appreciate saying that there is no systemic racism in healthcare. So it's a bad apple in the barrel if anything happens, right? And we see this across because it's not informed by a historical perspective, which I really appreciated you bringing. So thank you very much and for including me in the conversation.
By way of benediction, I want to thank you all very much for coming and bearing with me for this time. I hope it has been of some benefit, and I do deeply appreciate having this conversation and this time with you. I hope that you will remain blessed these days, always, and in all ways, to quote Toni Morrison. Take care.